Welcome to this next video in which we are discussing the auditory system. Okay, so in this video what we're going to now look at is the central auditory pathways. We're going to see where these bipolar neurons which innervate the hair cells are actually going to send their central processes to relay the information onwards. Now we are going to follow this story up to the primary auditory cortex, but we won't go beyond that. We won't talk about the interpretation and language and things like that. That's more topics for neuropsychology. We'll just go up to the primary auditory cortex. Now, the second thing I want to say is that this is actually quite a complicated story, and to try and make it easier I'm going to split it into two halves. I'm going to firstly tell you the very easy bit of the story, which is just neuron after neuron after neuron after neuron, i.e. a nice linear pathway, but that's not the complete story, and I'm going to then come back and tell you the bit that makes it a little bit more complicated, but also very, very beautiful. But I'm going to leave that bit off initially and just talk about the simple bit. Okay, right. So we have seen that the central processes of these bipolar neurons are going to go into the cochlear nerve, which will then fuse with the vestibular nerve to make the vestibular cochlear nerve, and we now want to see how is this going to enter the brainstem. Okay, so I'll go over the page and we'll draw a picture of the brainstem. So firstly, and let me just straighten up the camera a little bit. Okay, that's better. So firstly, I'm going to show you where the vestibular cochlear nerve actually enters the brainstem. So let me draw a basic picture of the brainstem. So I'll have the medulla and the pons portion of the brainstem on my picture. So here, this is meant to be the medulla, and then of course underneath the medulla you'll have the spinal cord. So here's the beginning of the spinal cord. To make the medulla more distinguishable, I'll give it its pyramids at the front here, which remember are the corticospinal tracts. So here is the right pyramid, and here is the left pyramid, and we'll also put the inferior olives on here as well, which are the other landmark that you can see when you're looking at the front of the medulla. So I'll colour in the inferior olives here in red. Okay, so labelling a few things up then here. These are the inferior olives that I've coloured in here in red, and the whole thing is the medulla so far. Okay, the lowest portion of the brainstem. Then above the medulla we will then have the pons, and the pons is a very nice simple structure. It just looks like this, a smooth anterior surface here. And then above the pons I'll put on the midbrain with the two cerebral peduncles at the front here. So there's the right cerebral peduncle, here is the left cerebral peduncle, and then going backwards the rest of the midbrain here, like so. Okay, so there is my picture of the brainstem structures: medulla, pons, and midbrain, and I'll just label them up. So this is the medulla, the lowest portion, and then the pons, and then above the pons we've got the midbrain here. Okay, so what we now want to see is where does the vestibular cochlear nerve enter the brainstem. Now remember, the vestibular cochlear nerve will be emerging from the internal acoustic meatus. So if I just redraw a picture I showed you earlier, which is the picture where we've opened up the top of the skull. So we've chopped off the top of the skull and we can see the different cranial fossae. So here's the anterior cranial fossa, the sella turcica where the pituitary gland will be sitting there. Here's the middle cranial fossa, all of this, and then we've got the posterior cranial fossa here. And remember, this line here is representing the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and then in the back of the petrous portion of the temporal bone there is a hole, and that's the internal acoustic meatus, and that's the hole out of which the vestibular cochlear nerve will be emerging. Okay, so this is the internal acoustic meatus. Coming back to the brainstem then, the brainstem is sitting in this position here. Imagine flipping this round 180 degrees and inserting it in there so that the spinal cord emerges from the foramen magnum there. Then you'll have the brainstem sitting very close to this, and in fact the vestibular cochlear nerve is going to enter the brainstem at the junction between the pons and the medulla, and it enters it reasonably laterally. So here in green, these can represent the vestibular-cochlear nerves. Now initially we are just going to follow the pathway for one side. Now we've been doing the right side all along, so we will stick with the right hand side here. Okay, remember patient's right hand side, we're looking from the front, so this is the right hand side for the patient. Okay, so we will follow the right vestibular-cochlear nerve entering here, and we'll see where those central processes of those bipolar neurons coming from the auditory system are actually going to go. So what I want to do then is I want to take a cross-section, transverse cross-section through the lower portion of the pons here. And the fancy word for lower portion is to call it the caudal portion. So caudal means towards the tail. So this is the portion of the pons that is towards the tail, the caudal portion of the pons. So I'm going to take a transverse cross-section of the caudal portion of the pons, and I want to show you the different nuclei that are going to be involved in this auditory pathway. Okay, so let me draw then my first section. So this is going to be the caudal portion of the pons. So at the posterior aspect, what you'll have is the fourth ventricle, and you'll also have the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which is what these structures are here. So the inferior cerebellar peduncles are these places where the cerebellum is attached to the brainstem. So there are lots of cerebellar peduncles. There's two superior cerebellar peduncles, the two middle cerebellar peduncles, and in this cross-section, right at the caudal portion of the pons and also at the superior portion of the midbrain, there are the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and all these are places where a huge number of axons are leaving the brainstem and going into the cerebellum behind, and then there's a space in between the brainstem and the cerebellum, which is the fourth ventricle, which is this space here. So these are the inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, now coming forward, it's going to look more like this. Okay, remember this is the very caudal portion of the pons. Okay, so just putting a little bit of colour on here. The inferior cerebellar peduncles are these portions where we've got lots of axons running into the cerebellum, feeding information into the cerebellum. Okay, right. Other things that I want to put on here, or just point out, are right at the front here, these two little impressions here. These are the faint bits that are the continuation of the pyramids upwards, or are the portion of the corticospinal tract before they become the pyramids. They're not as obvious as the pyramids, but they, at the caudal portion of the pons, they start to become apparent here. So I might just sort of put these on. So these are the corticospinal tracts going down to supply the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. So corticospinal tracts, and I'll have those in red. Okay, other important structures, just to give us bearing of where we are the medial lemniscuses, so I'll put those on as well. So in this position and also in this position we'll have the medial lemniscuses. So these are very important ascending tracts. So the corticospinal tracts, they are descending tracts. They are axons going downwards to relay information from the brain down to the spinal cord. The medial lemniscuses, these are, or medial lemnisci I think is probably the plural. The medial lemniscus, medial lemnisci are ascending tracts. They are going to be carrying information from the spinal cord up to the brain, sensory information. Okay, so there are other very famous structures. So there's just a few famous structures to put on the picture. They're not relevant to what we're discussing, but just very famous structures that would be at this level in those positions. Okay, right. So what I now want to show you is where the central processes coming in of these bipolar neurons in the vestibular-cochlear nerves are actually going to go. So on the lateral portion of the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and remember we're looking at this on the right hand side initially, On the lateral side of the inferior cerebellar peduncles, you actually have some nuclei within this portion of tissue. So of course the inferior cerebellar peduncles, they consist of loads of axons running into the cerebellum, but amongst those axons you can actually have some cell bodies, and indeed you do have some cell bodies. So over here you're actually going to have two important nuclei for the auditory system, and these are the cochlear nuclei, and we're going to focus on the right hand side, even though I've drawn the left hand side in there. Okay, so you have these two cochlear nuclei. One is known as the dorsal cochlear nuclei, or dorsal cochlear nucleus rather, and the other is called the ventral cochlear nucleus. So the dorsal cochlear nucleus is the one on the posterior side, of course, because dorsal is just another word for posterior, and the ventral one is the one on the anterior side. So these two that I've coloured in blue there, those are the dorsal cochlear nuclei, and then the ones that are now colouring in green towards the front, those are the ventral cochlear nuclei. Okay, now we're not going to initially talk about the ventral cochlear nuclei. We'll come back to those because those are involved in the more complicated bit. The dorsal cochlear nuclei are involved in the extremely simple bit, and therefore we're going to start off with that portion. So in come the vestibulocochlear nerves in this sort of position, like so. So here is our right vestibulocochlear nerve, here is our left vestibulocochlear nerve, and what actually happens is all of the bipolar neurons that are coming in, all of their central processes, they're going to bifurcate, and they're going to send one ending into the dorsal cochlear nucleus and one ending into the ventral cochlear nucleus. Now, that's all I'm going to say about the ventral cochlear nucleus for now. We're going to concentrate completely on the dorsal cochlear nucleus because it's so simple. Okay, so in the dorsal cochlear nucleus, what's going to happen is this is going to synapse onto a second order neuron, and the picture's a little small for me to show it, but I'll try my best. So here comes, actually, how am I going to show this? Well, I'll just put a dot there, and here comes the axon. So here comes the second order neuron, and it's going to send its axon out, and its axon will run in the inferior cerebellar peduncle amongst all the axons that are going backwards and into the cerebellum. It will go medially like this, and it's going to cross the midline onto the other side, and it's going to actually go into an ascending tract known as the lateral lemniscus, and the lateral lemniscus is in this sort of position. And of course you have two of them again. You have a left lateral lemniscus and a right lateral lemniscus. So you have the lateral lemnisci. I think lemnisci is the plural of lemniscus. So this is the lateral lemniscus. So just to exaggerate this point, I want to make sure everyone is aware, because the picture isn't incredibly clear, but there is a synapse there. The primary neuron, so I might just put, actually, this is the first order neuron, and here this is the second order neuron. So there is a synapse in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. And by the way, the dorsal cochlear nucleus for short can be abbreviated down to the DCN. Okay, so there is a synapse in the DCN where the first order neuron synapses onto the second order neuron. And now the second order neuron, it's going to send its axon across the midline into the contralateral lateral lemniscus. So I'm going to colour in the lateral lemniscuses, or lemnisci, in yellow here. Okay, so here comes my second order neuron, which has its cell body in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. It's crossing the midline, going into the contralateral. So contralateral is a fancy word meaning on the opposite side to. So it's going into the left lateral lemniscus, even though all of the information is coming from the right ear here, and has come in through the right vestibular cochlear nerve. Okay, so it goes into the contralateral lateral lemniscus, and it's then going to ascend up. So the lateral lemniscus, going back to this picture up here, is going to ascend up the pons, on both sides of course, so both of the lateral lemnisci ascend up, and they're going to go into the midbrain, and they're going to end up with the inferior colliculus of the midbrain. So the next picture that I need to show you is a cross-section of the caudal portion of the midbrain. So the next section that I'm going to draw out is going to be caudal midbrain. So we're again going to take a transverse section but this time it's going to be through the midbrain, and it's going to be through the lower portion of the midbrain, not the top portion of the midbrain, the lower portion. So we're going to go through the inferior colliculi rather than the superior colliculi. So I'll just remind you, in case you are unaware of what the colliculi of the midbrain are, I've got them shown here. And those little bulges on the back of the midbrain. Let's take a picture from the back of the midbrain. So if we're now looking from the back, so this is the midbrain from the back. It's rather more boring than it from the front. But on the back, the midbrain has 4 swellings, like so. So 4 extensions backwards, sort of half domes or domes backwards. Semispheres, I suppose you could describe them as, or hemispheres, whatever the word is for half a sphere. Okay, so these little extensions back on the wall of the midbrain, and the 2 inferior ones here are known as the inferior colliculi, and the singular is inferior colliculus, and the 2 superior ones here are known as the superior colliculi, and again the singular is superior colliculus. So we are going to take a cross-section through the midbrain where we will see the inferior colliculi rather than the superior colliculi, because it's the inferior colliculi that are going to be involved in the auditory pathway, and the superior colliculi aren't going to have anything to do with it. So my next cross-section then is going to be a caudal section of the midbrain. So first thing I'll draw on, here are the inferior colliculi. And then, again, we're orienting everything the same way around. This is posterior, this is anterior, this is posterior, this is going to be anterior. Then, as we extend forward, here is the right cerebral peduncle. Okay. Then we'll have the left cerebral peduncle, so I'm viewing everything from above rather than from below, as you would do in a CT scan. Okay, right, so here is the midbrain viewed from above. Okay, so putting a few landmark structures on then. Here, just before the place where you'd have the corticospinal tract and other descending and ascending tracts, here you'll have the substantia nigra tissue. So I'll colour this in black here. Very famous nucleus, of course. So in black, this is the substantia nigra of the midbrain. And then to put on another important structure, we'll have the cerebral aqueduct and also the periaqueductal grey. So here will of course be the cerebral aqueduct, which moves through the midbrain, connecting the 4th ventricle to the 3rd ventricle, and then surrounding the cerebral aqueduct we've got the periaqueductal grey, which for short is abbreviated down to the PAG. So I'll colour in the periaqueductal grey in red here. Now, the bits that are important for us are back here, which are the inferior colliculi. Okay, so here are the nuclei of the inferior colliculi that I'm colouring in here in pink. So those are the inferior colliculi. And this is where the next synapse of the auditory pathway is going to be placed. So in the inferior colliculi. So, to remind you of where we've got to so far, what has happened is all of these bipolar neuron central processes have come in, they've synapsed with second order neuron, and the second order neuron in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. We haven't talked about the ventral cochlear nucleus, we'll come back to that. What's then happened is the second order neuron, its axon has crossed the midline, gone into the contralateral lateral lemniscus, and is now ascending on the contralateral side, and it's going to come into the contralateral lateral lemniscus. So up it comes, and it's going to end up in here, and it's in here that it's now going to synapse onto the third order neuron. So here is its ending, and now we've got our third order neuron here. Now, where is the third order neuron going to go now? So this is our third order neuron that's going to transmit the information further. It's going to take the information up to the medial geniculate body, or the medial geniculate nucleus. So how am I going to show you the medial geniculate nucleus? So again, the best way to show you the medial geniculate nucleus is to look from behind. So I'm going to actually draw this picture out again, but I'm going to show you things that are above it as well. So now, here is a picture once again of the midbrain from behind. Here we have the inferior colliculi. here the superior colliculi, and of course this is the left inferior colliculus, which corresponds to this one here. This is the left inferior colliculus. Okay, so hopefully you're oriented. And now I need to add on structures that are going to be sitting above the midbrain. So above the midbrain you have the thalami. So here is the left thalamus, and here is the right thalamus. So these are the thalami, and underneath the thalami you have two important bodies or nuclei known as the medial geniculate nuclei and lateral geniculate nuclei, which I've put here. So let me colour in the different structures that I've got here. So in the thalami are these structures here in orange. Okay, and now we've got these two nuclei here, or bodies, which are the medial and then the lateral geniculate body. Now we're not going to discuss the lateral geniculate body at all. I'm just putting it there for perspective so that you can see the anatomy. We're going to be interested in the medial geniculate bodies. Okay, you can also call them the medial and lateral geniculate nuclei. So the medial one is of course the one that's closer to the midline. So these two, so you've got a left medial geniculate nucleus and the right medial geniculate nucleus. And the lateral ones are the ones that are further away from the midline, those ones that I've now coloured in blue. Okay, so what's now going to happen is the third order neuron from the inferior colliculus is going to send up its axon into the medial geniculate nucleus on the same side as it. So here is the left inferior colliculus, here is the left medial geniculate body. There is a connection between the inferior colliculi and their ipsilateral medial geniculate bodies. So there is a connection that is anatomically visible if you're looking at this portion of the brain from the back, and this is known as the inferior brachium. So this connection between the medial geniculate nucleus and the ipsilateral inferior colliculus is known as the inferior brachium. Okay, so continuing this pathway on, here is our third order neuron here, and it's going to send up its axon into the medial geniculate nucleus, and there is going to be the next synapse. So here now comes the fourth order neuron. Okay, so I'm just going to repeat what we've done so far because it's worth repeating, and I'm going to straighten this piece of paper up as well. Right, so what we've seen so far is here comes the central process of the bipolar neuron, and this is for every single bipolar neuron that is coming in the vestibulocochlear nerve. Each one of them is going to synapse on a second order neuron which has its cell body in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Then what's going to happen is this second order neuron is going to send its axon onto the contralateral side, in this case the left hand side now, and it's going to ascend in the lateral lemniscus up to the contralateral inferior colliculus here, where it will synapse into a third order neuron. Okay, this third order neuron is then going to go up in the inferior brachium, and I'm just going to highlight the inferior brachium. So the inferior brachium is this bit in blue, this white matter connection between the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate body. And then in the medial geniculate body, the third order neuron is going to synapse onto a fourth order neuron, and now this fourth order neuron is going to transmit the information to the primary auditory cortex. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you is where actually is the primary auditory cortex. So let me draw a picture then now of the brain from the left hand side. So of course we've seen that all of this information that's coming from the right ear is going up onto the left side of the brain, so it's going to go to the left primary auditory cortex. So I'm going to now draw you a picture of the brain viewed from the left hand side. So this should be familiar to you. So here, this is the left cerebral hemisphere, and then poking out from underneath you'll have the lower portions of the brainstem. So here we have the pons from the left hand side, the medulla from the left hand side, the spinal cord, and then behind it you'll have the cerebellum there. Okay, so putting on a nice landmark, here is the central sulcus, and of course in front of the central sulcus you'll have the primary motor cortex, and behind the central sulcus you'll have the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is the central sulcus. Now, the primary auditory cortex is actually a portion of the temporal lobe's cortex, and it's a portion that isn't actually easily visible to us at all, because it's part that actually faces up into the lateral fissure. So this fissure in between the superior portion of the cerebral hemisphere and then the temporal lobe here, this is known as the lateral fissure. Okay, it's also sometimes called the Sylvian fissure, so if you like, you can call it the Sylvian fissure as well. You will occasionally hear surgeons refer to it as the Sylvian fissure rather than the lateral fissure. Okay, now that fissure, the lateral fissure, has portions of cortex of the temporal lobe and also of the superior portion of the cerebral hemisphere facing down into it. And it's there that you actually find the primary auditory cortex, so that a bit of it is visible, and it's sort of in this position here underneath the primary somatosensory cortex. So effectively, if you follow the primary somatosensory cortex down and then jump across the lateral fissure, that portion there is the primary auditory cortex, and this is the portion of cortex that we're really interested in. So the primary auditory cortex, it has an abbreviated name that some people will use, which is to call it A1. Okay, right. So what I want to do is now draw you a picture of the temporal lobe viewed as though we're a little man standing in the lateral fissure looking down at the top of the temporal lobe. Okay, so here goes. So this is supposed to be the temporal lobe viewed from above if we were sitting in the lateral fissure. Now there are two sulci which mark out a gyrus on the superior surface of the temporal lobe here. So remember, a sulcus is a little invagination of the cortex inwards. A gyrus is then a portion in between two sulci. So there are two sulci, which I'll put in here on this picture, that are going to demarcate a gyrus there, and that gyrus is where the primary auditory cortex is, so it's all of this portion here. Okay, and this gyrus has a special name. It's known as the gyrus of Heschel. So the gyrus of Heschel. So the primary auditory cortex is sitting on the gyrus of Heschel. Now, the gyrus of Heschel has a tonotopic map. Okay, so information coming about low tone frequency sounds is going to be taken to this portion of the primary auditory cortex, i.e. the lateral portion of the primary auditory cortex, the bit that is closest to the entrance to the lateral fissure. And information about high pitch sounds, so high frequency sounds, is going to go more to this medial portion of the gyrus of Heschel. Okay, so low frequency sounds are going to go here, high frequency sounds are going to go here. So let's now put this entire picture together. We know that we have this massive great organ of Corti, and I'll go back over on here. We have this massive great organ of Corti that goes all the way along the basilar membrane, and that when we have high frequency sounds, those are going to cause oscillations in the basal portion of the basilar membrane, and therefore you're going to get activation of the bipolar neurons innervating the organ of Corti over here. And when you have low pitch sounds, you're going to get oscillation in the apical portion of the basilar membrane, and therefore you're going to be activating the bipolar neurons innervating the organ of Corti over here. We know that there is a tonotopic map of the organ of Corti, and therefore a tonotopic map of bipolar neurons effectively. We know that information about what frequency you are hearing is encoded by the bipolar neurons. Overall, the information from bipolar neurons coming from the apical portion, i.e. about low frequency sounds, is eventually going to be transmitted to this portion of the primary auditory cortex here, the lateral portion of the gyrus of Heschel. Whereas the information coming from bipolar neurons and the basal portion of the cochlear duct, that is eventually going to be transmitted to this portion of the primary auditory cortex. And we are seeing the pathways by which all of the bipolar neurons are going to take the information here. All we now need to do is look at this final connection where the fourth order neuron here is going to deliver the information to the primary auditory cortex. So what's going to happen is the axon of these fourth order neurons are going to send the information through a structure known as the auditory radiation. So to show this, what's best done is to take a coronal section of the brain. So I'll show this like so. So here, this is a coronal section of the brain, and I'm imagining that we're looking from behind, like so. So, this is the longitudinal fissure separating the two cerebral hemispheres. This is the left cerebral hemisphere, this is the right cerebral hemisphere. This is the right lateral fissure. Then of course we've got the bit where the lateral fissure opens up and you've got the insular cortex facing here. Here is the gyrus of Heschel here, facing into the lateral fissure. Now let's add on our brainstem structures here. So we'll have the thalami here, and then we'll have midbrain underneath that, etc. And now we can put the medial geniculate nucleus there. So here's the medial geniculate body, and what's going to happen is it's going to send the axon of this fourth order neuron from here to here, and there's a great big tract of white matter from the medial geniculate nuclei or nucleus on each side to its ipsilateral primary auditory cortex, A1 here. So this is A1, and this tract of white matter here, this is known as the auditory radiation. Okay, right, so that's how the information is going to be delivered from the bipolar neurons up to the primary auditory cortex. And I'll remind you that information coming from bipolar neurons which innervate the basal portion of the cochlear duct, i.e. the portion that will oscillate in response to high frequencies, their information is overall going to be transmitted to these medial portions of the primary auditory cortex, i.e. the final fourth order neuron is going to synapse onto neurons in the medial portion of the primary auditory cortex, whereas bipolar neurons innervating the apical portion of the cochlear duct, basilar membrane, organ of Corti, whatever you want to say, which are encoding information about low frequency sounds, they are eventually going to have their information delivered to the lateral portion of the primary auditory cortex, i.e. the fourth order neuron will deliver the information to this lateral portion of the gyrus of Heschel. Okay, so that's the simple account of the central auditory pathways. Where is this going to get more complicated? Well, this is going to get more complicated because we are going to have to consider the fact that you have two ears and that both of them are actually going to be activated by a sound. However, the information from both ears is not actually always going to get up to the brain, as we'll see. Well, it's not going to get up to the primary auditory cortexes, as we'll see. So there is a lot that's going to complicate this. However, for now, I think we'll have a break, and in the next video I'll tell you how this gets so much more complicated.